right, now we're
Well,
good. Now we're good.
So if you guys could all pull out like your personal device, phone, whatever you, preferably a phone, you can either scan this URL or just follow this link. It's gonna go to a BuzzFeed quiz that I want you all to take.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take too long, so just take a couple minutes,
Literally just did it.
get that
Your
going,
camera and it'll scan it.
and when you
Your
have,
actual camera.
so when you finish taking the quiz, make note of like the answer that it gives you on your paper, and then you can put your personal devices away. And it doesn't look like many of you have a blank piece of paper, so you can just use the back of this little hack sheet that will be our first handout to make note of.
So we're taking
We're going on vacation?
We're going on vacation.
Finding out your sidekick
Okay.
to go on vacation with.
This is terrible.
Get excited.
The forest.
I don't like these music options.
Yeah, these music options are
Terrible.
disgusting. What the?
Oh no.
What?
No.
Can we use anything normal, please? What is an Afrobeat?
I don't know, but that's what I picked because everything else
I'm
sounded
a kid's pop, at least I know
I
the
know
song
I don't like everything else. Oh.
Did everyone get to the quiz okay?
Yes.
Where's the meat?
We're starving. What are you eating? Well.
I love that.
Am I writing it down on this?
Yeah, just make a note of it, and then when you're done making a note of it, I'll know you're all set when you put your spice away.
Do you want us to write like what it says about it or just who we are?
It's okay, you can just write who you are.
All right.
Oh heck yeah.
Cute.
Oh what? Do we get the same people? We got the same person. Did we get the same? You got them too.
Is that
Some people are going on vacation.
That's what we got too.
You got that too?
I got Olaf.
I got Olaf.
AKA, I am a boy.
So I know like you kind of just all said, but I just want to make sure I hear all the answers. Can everyone just go around the table starting with Rachel? Who did you get?
I got Olaf. I got Olaf.
Timon and Pumbaa.
Timon and Pumbaa.
I got Tinkerbell when I did it.
Oh, I see that.
So, so why do you think we all got different answers?
We're all different people with different interests.
Okay, so what exactly was this quiz using to figure out who your sidekick would be? Or what were some of the variables in play here?
Like our choices.
Yep, and so what were some of the choices you made?
Where we're going to stay.
Where we're gonna stay,
Where you're gonna go?
where you're gonna go,
What we're going to
Riley?
eat.
We're gonna
Sorry.
eat.
eat,
Bye.
We're gonna listen to.
listen, music, what we're gonna buy, so what we're gonna go shopping for. So all these different things. So let's just take two of them for example, what we're gonna eat and what we're gonna buy. Are those two things normally related? Like would those two things normally impact each other much?
Unless
I
you're
don't know.
buying.
Or when you were
Unless you're
making the decision that
buying
you just made?
Or
Buying a new
maybe.
shirt if you just put barbecue sauce on your other one.
Well, yes, but in this case scenario, did the decision you made
No.
as to what you were going to buy impact what you were going to eat? Probably not. They're two separate decisions. But eventually, they collected data from both of those decisions and helped them inform the final decision or make some sort of conclusion. So that is going to bring us right into our main lesson today. So we're talking about all of these different variables, different categories that are maybe impacting a final decision, and we're going to see how the relationships between those and how those impact each other. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little data collection. So in order to get the variables and stuff, we're going to need some information. So if you look over the paper I just gave you, there's a couple different things that we're going to be collecting data on. So you're going to work in partners. I know, Rachel, you're kind of a third, so maybe you can just join. So it shouldn't take long to do this data collection, but before we do that, we need to figure out what we need to know before we collect the data. So take a minute to read that on your own. So what do you notice, or what are you thinking that maybe you need to know before you start collecting data, Riley?
It says number of pieces of fruit. Is that like number of servings of fruit, or every time I eat a grape, that's a piece?
Okay, so how I want this little discussion to go, before we decide how we're going to collect the data, I want us to come to a class consensus. So I purposely made some of these things a little bit vague so that we can inform how we want as a class to collect the data. So Riley, can you pose that question again, and then let's have a discussion about it.
I was asking the number of pieces of fruit per day, because like if you eat strawberries or grapes versus somebody who eats more like apples and cantaloupe,
Okay.
you know, like, it's gonna skew the data.
Okay. So, thoughts?
I think that we should do servings because like a banana is gonna be way more than like a grape, and if we
Or
just
a
do
cantaloupe.
pieces or cantaloupe, I guess, then it'd be like saying this is the same amount of fruit, which
Yeah,
It ain't.
If you ate half of a cantaloupe,
I'd be impressed.
you
first of
know,
all,
versus if you ate 4 grapes, you know.
Yeah.
Well,
I feel like it could mess up our data.
Okay. So we want to do servings of fruit. Does everyone thumbs up if you agree? Okay. So what else are we thinking as we see? What
What
questions do you have?
The heck is hand height?
Hand height.
Is that like
Is it like from the top to like where your wrist starts?
What do you think?
so for the for things like the NFL and NBA Combine, when they measure like hand size, they measure from the tip of the thumb to the pinky.
but that's width, not height.
Yeah, I know. I'm just.
Is it
I think
the
we
same
just put your
though?
hand down and measure the height.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we're gonna use the table. We can use a resource in the room. We can use the table, and when you set your hand on the, that'll be the bottom,
Does
and you'll measure
everybody
to the
else
top
have?
of the
Does
finger.
everybody else have a bone right here that
Yeah.
we could?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Oh, yeah, that really hard one.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the hard
I
bone.
hope
Yeah.
we all
Sorry,
have
no,
a
that's
bone.
not what I meant. That's not what I meant.
So you're gonna go from this bone to the top of your middle finger.
Sounds good.
Idiot.
Okay,
Okay.
so that's that measurement. What unit are we gonna measure these in?
I would
Feet.
like, I'd say inches. Your hand.
Or
can be
centimeters.
feet.
Either one.
I feel like inches will work
Well, how do we use?
better.
I would normally let the class decide, but because I needed to bring in some extra data, because there's only 5 of you, we're gonna do it in centimeters today.
Great, love centimeters.
Okay,
How do we
Um,
measure pieces?
so we're gonna do everything in centimeters. Bone to middle. Any other things we need to clear up before we start collecting data?
Are we doing height with or without like shoes? Without?
I'm wearing heels, so.
Yeah, without.
Okay. Anything else?
Great.
Does everyone understand what shoulder breadth is? Tip of the shoulder to tip of the shoulder?
Yeah, are we doing it from like behind us, like across your back?
Yeah, you put it
Okay.
on the wall and then you stand next to it, right?
Oh yeah, that works. We can stand against the wall and use a dry erase marker to mark it and then just turn around. and
Oh,
measure it.
yeah.
Yeah, sure.
That's what I said. Yeah.
Are there dry erase markers in
We
there?
only have one dry erase marker, so maybe somebody can start at hand height, or like
Okay.
somebody
Yeah.
start with it and somebody can finish with it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would also normally let students pick their partners today, but there's only like a couple of you, so I have 3 of these.
Great.
We'll make do with them. So take a couple minutes if you want an extra measure. Take a couple minutes and go ahead and collect that data.
So we've got. So
59
take off
to
your shoes. We're gonna
110.
measure your
What is that?
height first.
Handy.
Uh,
Making socks.
Ew,
Really great.
that's so cute. Okay,
So
do you want to hold the
this is
top and I'll hold the
Sure.
bottom so you can read it from the top?
it's actually 51, I think.
Thank goodness.
All right.
Can I have everyone's attention for 1 second?
Yes.
I forgot to point out, your papers have where you can write down your data collection information. So make sure as you're going that you actually record it.
Okay.
Like hold that, and then I need to grab another one because you're
This
taller
is
than
long enough, yeah.
I guess.
Shoot.
So you guys can use the extra after if you want to start with shoulders.
Ooh. Good call.
You
Where's an
are,
expo marker?
like,
All right.
I'd say
Well, don't
like
put it at an
19.
angle.
Mark it
or,
off, like.
Don't put it at
yeah, I'm trying not to.
straight up.
Like, where
You're like-
right here.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you're like 15 centimeters beyond this first one, so 165 centimeters.
But we started it at 1, right? Oh, we started it here.
We started it there, right, because there's no
47.
So
end.
take away 2, right?
No,
47.
because this ends
Oh.
at 1.
Cameron?
Everything's on kind of
So,
your.
yeah,
Yes.
180.
Okay.
Okay.
160
165.
is her total?
Yeah.
So we have 150 and 15.
Alright, you next.
Okay. My shoes make
Pretty
it
scientific.
sorry, guys.
I'm coming here to put my shoes back here.
Alright. There's that.
Go.
You need just
44.
a little bit more.
All right. Height. No, they're not. They're doing height. Hand height.
Okay, now
That's
grab
what I meant.
Okay. Somehow, like, what
Well,
the
this goes
difference.
to 150.
20.
Right,
Yeah, that'd make you 166.
Oh, that's true.
right. Let's remeasure Natalie then.
So how'd you, like,
I wrapped it, yeah.
Oh.
I did this.
Hold
17.
You.
How many servings of fruit do you eat per day?
Actually, pretty fruity kind of guy.
Alright,
So
yeah, you're definitely closer to like 19.
Okay.
I'd say about like,
So what
how
was
many
that
do you
you
eat?
said?
166.
So I eat
So
fruit
add-
3 times per day.
She's like
I eat
169.
an orange, and an apple, and like and then strawberry. But I don't know how many servings of strawberries.
All heels.
Go.
I know.
I'm just gonna say that's 1 serving when I eat strawberries.
Okay.
I'm just gonna say I eat
This is
3.
why we never did
I eat fruit 3
volleyball
times
and
per day.
sensitive feet.
So like I eat like fruit maybe like twice a day.
What do you guys have left? Just are you
Number of
discussing
letters
fruit?
and- yes, we're discussing fruit.
Okay. Hard decision this morning.
Oh,
Come on. And then number of letters in the last name.
All right.
Oh, that's how we did this
You're
back.
just about done. So you can trade off.
Alright, so
Pretty close.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5,
That's fine.
6-ish.
Alright.
I don't know. I never got
I
like
think
a
they're
real
gonna borrow one of your extra.
We'll
Yes.
consider it.
You're
Give me
166
it
too.
right now.
ish.
Do we want to do hand type now?
Sure.
Alright, so we're just gonna.
Is it like 19?
19. Yeah.
184. I don't know what that is. 10 feet. Lord, if you step on
Say
it,
like
it
17.
take a little bit away. I want you to get as tall as you possibly can.
You do have baby hands.
I do. I do. It made guitar playing impossible, so I stopped.
Pull it a little bit tighter top.
Alright, can you look at the bottom
Thank you, sir.
here? It's not
Plus
17 though.
3.
Yeah.
So you also
Alright.
Give me this. This isn't right.
Oh.
What?
Okay, let's
Your
do
hands
yours.
are like slightly larger.
So yours is 17.
Let's do yours again.
Hers is
So now
not
that you
much
guys are all
bigger than
set,
mine.
can we regroup for 1 second so I can give you the next set of instructions for when you're ready to move on?
Yes.
So once you have everyone's data, you're gonna come up with your partner and type in for your 2 people your data. So we're gonna collect all the class data on here. Once you type in your data, you'll pick up the whole class data collection sheet and you can start filling that out when you get back to your seat. Thumbs up if it makes sense? Cool.
Shoulder breadth.
Bread. I love bread.
Bread.
5 pieces of fruit per day. That's wild.
Bread.
Is that on your computer?
That's solid.
Yeah.
Oh wait, we measure your.
Yeah.
Are you gonna put mine in as
And
well?
a marker
Sorry.
on
Put me in
her
a student
teacher
honor.
clothes.
So we're just doing it from like right here.
My name's Riley.
Oh,
It's
okay.
like shoulder to shoulder, so like the edge of her shoulder.
Like here.
Yeah. It's like about 41.
Yeah.
Me?
10.
Great.
2 letters?
So
What?
sorry.
Did you get the data collection sheet?
How are there 2 letters in
Someone
somebody's
says
last
I'm
name?
good. I'm close in person with each other.
Whose last name has 2
Okay.
letters?
A lot of last
Have
names
you
from like
always
ancient
said
Pacific.
Huh.
Sorry, it's the coffee.
It's alright.
Yours is like 43.
Okay.
So you can go ahead and start working on filling that out.
Alright.
Did you get one for each of you?
No.
One for each?
Just gonna say, I was like, can't even go ahead.
There you go, you can start working on filling that out.
Ah.
Alright.
There you go.
Man.
Easier this time, huh?
How do you do my this time? Hey, you guys want to do your shoulder? You ready to do it?
We did.
All
Thank
right.
you very much. Though. Appreciate the offer.
Is it the bottom or is it like
That's 38.
38? Okay, I don't know.
What are you, 38?
He's like all hot.
Wait, what were you at?
49. Number
Or
of
small men.
pieces of fruit per day. Probably like 2.
Yeah. 2. I try for 2.
2 veggies count or
Just fruit.
Yeah.
I just chopped up
We put our info up there, right? Yep. Does it matter which letters?
Wait, number of letters and last name.
Mine's 8.
7.
If it helps, you can look. It's the top window up there.
Uh-oh,
If
I'm
that helps
missing a
you.
data
Wow.
You also have
Missing a
7.
data point.
Natalie has 7 too.
Yeah. Or yeah.
I got it.
249.
Oh, okay.
64.
And so for you guys, because we don't have a full class, I gave you that extra data sheet, so that's already entered in here as just part of our class data, to give us some extra data points. So obviously in a real classroom, I wouldn't have done that, but
Rachel, how many fruit you eat?
2.
Letters, 7 you said?
Yep.
Jillian, how many letters?
8. 2.
Excuse me. Five.
Are we just transferring it
Five
from here onto
servings
here?
of fruit. That is wild.
because normally it would have been, this was completely empty. So if you just want to record the new numbers, that's
Oh,
also
okay.
fine, because obviously like normally this would all be student data.
Okay.
So as Natalie's the last one to start sitting down and filling out the whole class data sheet, as you're filling this out, start thinking about what trends you see, how are these variables related, what are you observing as you're writing in these numbers.
Oh wait, Nat, mine was 166, not 164.
I can switch it.
They're both 166. Okay.
Shots in case it can't read my own handwriting.
Are these your friends that you tested, or was it given to you online, or did you make it up?
This was like a statistics that I found of just like some averages of a large data set, so.
Who eats 3 fruit? I'm so proud of you.
What'd you say?
It's like, who eats 3 fruit? I'm so proud of you.
It tastes good.
Video?
It is.
Congratulations.
It tastes good.
We
Well,
got
that is
cantaloupe
so
from
cool.
Aldi and we're just waiting for it to write. I'm excited.
So you can keep finishing writing down, but I'm noticing some people are finished up. So can we just share some thoughts? What observations did you make as you wrote down this data?
Well, the boys seem to be taller than we are. Surprising, but I'll get over it.
Okay.
I'm noticing that like the bigger the height is, the bigger the shoulder breadth and the hand height is.
Great. So maybe there's some
Typically-
relationship between these three.
Yeah.
What else?
Number of letters and last name and pieces of fruit eaten per day are pretty consistent. Like, most of us eat 2, except for
Okay.
Riley. And all of us either 7 or 8 letters in the last name.
Which is
I feel like
crazy
that
compared to
doesn't-
this.
No, but it doesn't.
just doesn't relate
doesn't
to each
relate
other
All
to
of
other
the people
things.
and the
What I'm gonna do
preset
is
data
just
set.
condense this. Does that help you to look at it all?
Yeah.
Make it the same size.
And I feel like, yeah.
Okay, so let's turn our attention to just these first two variables, height and shoulder breadth in centimeters. What do we notice about those? Anything? I know Jillian already made observation that she seems to think that as height is taller, shoulder breadth might be wider or broader.
That's definitely
Any
true.
other thoughts?
I think that I didn't actually do the math, so it's not gonna be right, but generally the height is like has a more variance than like the shoulder breadth. Like there's-
Okay, so the
Most of
range
them are
of
in the-
numbers is a
yeah.
little bit larger with heights.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure of that. I didn't actually look at the highest and the lowest, but it seems like that.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. Do you think that these two variables completely rely on each other? Or if one is, does that question make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay,
I don't think they completely rely on each other, but I feel like it definitely like plays some sort of a role. Because it
Yes.
also depends on like if you like work out your shoulders, and like if you're a swimmer, typically swimmers have like broader shoulders. So
Okay.
I mean, it could take something like that.
Okay. So maybe one doesn't rely on the other. So in every kind of data scenario you've seen thus far, or on most graphs you've graphed thus far, normally you have an independent variable and a dependent variable. Do those terms ring a bell? So this is going to be a little different, where we don't have an independent variable that we are changing. So where we have two variables and they aren't that direct relationship or that direct reliance that we have control over one, it's going to be called bivariate data. So let's break down this term as a class. We see in this first word bivariate, we have bi. What does bi mean? Can somebody raise a hand? Or I just saw it. Perfect. 2. So bi means 2. What do we think variate might mean? Or what does that sound like? What
Sounds
word?
like variable.
It sounds like variable. Okay, so if we think that this might mean 2 variable data, can anybody interpret that a little bit further? What do we think that means? Based on what we've talked about so
Information.
far.
You asked about what data means?
What 2 variable data? So like that's what the word broken down means, but what can we develop that definition a little bit further?
Data with like 2 factors or like 2 sets of data.
Yeah.
Or like in one set, you know?
Yeah. So we're going to have 2 different factors, 2 different variables in these sets of data, and they might be related or they might not. So they may have no association, meaning that they're completely independent from each other, or they might have some sort of association that we'll learn how to describe. Riley, question.
So they might have a correlation, but they can't be like described as a function or anything where you like
Right.
one exactly
So-
gives the other.
I like the word that you use, correlation. Are you more familiar with that term? So what we're going to use is association when we talk about the relationship between the two, but a similar synonym, correlation, maybe relationship, these are terms you might be familiar with, is how we're going to describe these. So now we've taken a look at this chart. So this specific type of table when we're talking about bivariate data is called a frequency table. So you're looking at how many occurrences happen, and we'll develop this type of table a little bit later, but I want to introduce you to the other way that we can represent bivariate data, which is on a scatter plot. So I'm going to give you this paper now, and you have 4 different blanks. So we're going to start just as a class, we're going to graph height and shoulder breadth on the graph that says graph 1. So let's just work together. I think we're all pretty familiar with the different kinds of aspects that we need to make a good graph. So let's just work through this together. What's the first thing that we want to put on a graph?
A title.
A title. What can we title this?
Height or
Height versus
shoulder breadth.
Yeah, sure.
Not hand height.
So you can do this with me as we go along. I'm just going to put SB because it's a little bit hard to write on here. Okay, what's the next thing we need on a good graph?
Label the
Raise a hand,
Oh.
just so that we can. Yeah.
Label the axes.
Okay, so what would you like to label the x-axis?
Maybe like shoulder breadth on the x.
Sure.
Height on the y.
And what are we measuring that in? Because we want to be as precise as
Centimeters.
possible. Yep. And you set up here will be height. Height in centimeters. Great. So what's one more thing we're missing before we actually start adding data on there?
Labeling your.
Yeah.
Labeling like the increments. of
Yeah,
data.
so I saw you counting a little bit. Did you figure out a good scale that we could use on the x-axis?
I was thinking 2s,
Okay.
maybe
So what number do you want to start at?
0, and then or should we start at? I don't know. Yeah. Maybe
So a
start-
scatter plot.
Oh, scatter.
Riley, did you have a thought before?
Whoa, this is a scatter plot?
Yeah. Does that?
That makes my thought
Can't we
invalid.
just count by 5?
What was your previous thought going to be?
If it was going to be like a plot, we could make the break, like the squiggle, and then start at like 30 or whatever, and then have like the break and then start at.
And so what does
40.
what does it being a scatter plot? How does that change your mind?
Because I don't really know what a scatter plot is.
Great. Well, we're learning. That's totally okay. But actually, your first thought applies really well. So a scatter plot, a really important thing is the whole goal of a scatter plot and a frequency table is to figure out what the association between these two variables is. So the goal of what you're viewing on this window is to figure out how we can see the data best. So in this case, we don't have any data points between 0 and 30, I think, right?
Right.
So it is completely okay on a scatter plot to start at a number other than 0. So based on that, Jillian, what number do you want to start at?
Well, I don't want it to all be like smushed over here.
Yeah.
So maybe start like, I think 30 would be good.
30, and what increment do you want to go by?
Probably 5s or 2s maybe.
Twos? So we're going to start at 30 and every line will be an increment of 2. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to label every other because my numbers won't fit. That's
Mine don't fit either.
And Cam, can you maybe talk to me a little bit about the scale for the y-axis?
So I was kind of looking at like the range, just like the minimum and max. I'm trying to see like the best way to kind of divide that up into only 12 sections, or I guess 12 boxes. And it looks like if you start with like, I was kind of thinking if we start with like 136 at the very bottom, like where our 0 would usually be on like a normal graph, and went by 3, it may work out kind of well.
That's a whack.
Okay.
But
Interesting.
Yeah, we can go with that.
It's
So we'll
just
start
a
at
thought.
136
Interesting.
and go up by 3s.
I'll make that.
Okay, so I'm actually going to pause right there. It's 8:33, so I only have 2 minutes left. So we didn't get to the majority of the meat of the lesson. I obviously introduced some different definitions to you guys, but from this point moving forward, it would have been really in the student's hand to develop some important arguments and make some, begin to talk about negative association versus positive association, which you might be familiar with. A positive trend means one's increasing while the other's increasing versus a negative trend. And I had a couple different activities set up for them to be able to do that. So I made a little packet for each of you with all of the handouts that were used in this lesson. But so from here, we would have finished graphing this as a class, and then I would have given them some time to practice on their own. We have all this data, so they could make a couple more scatter plots, and so they would have different examples of the different sets. And then the final activity that I would have used as a like summative assessment for this lesson was going to be, I just did a paper clip for you. I don't know why though. Wait a second.
Oh, I didn't stick my water on there.
The final activity, I have these little, I laminated little cards, which you have on the last page. And so this was going to be, they were going to sort them with a partner, and I left the terms to sort by completely up to them. So I was going to give them index cards that they could make the titles on, in hopes that kind of 2 different tools to summatively assess them. One would be to see what headings they put. So if they're comfortable with the vocab that we learned today, they should use that as the headings, like positive, negative association. And the second thing is sorting them and correctly identifying the association. So all of these are pretty similar. Either no association, positive, or negative. So the first one that I have in my hands is number of members in a family and number of letters and last names. So those aren't related at all, so they would have probably said no association. And a really important thing, the SMP that I was focusing on in this lesson, which we didn't quite get to, was SMP 3. So in every one of these situations, they could make an argument that might be different from another group's, but if they could defend it, that would be fair. So depending on their life experiences. And one other note, just from a teacher perspective about this lesson, you could cater this really well to your students. So the quiz at the beginning, you could use anything that would interest them. With these cards, you could cater it to anything that would interest them or maybe is more applicable to your population. Even the things that you collect data on, you could cater to them. So it's very adaptable. Did you have a question?
What grade would you, this specifically?
This is 8th grade statistics and probability. It's number 1 and number 4 is the introduction of the tables and the scatter plots.
And would you say this is more of a 1-day or 2-day lesson now that you've run it?
Now that I've run it, definitely 2 days. Yeah. I think the data collection, especially with a group of 3, definitely took longer than I was expecting. But don't know till you try.
Yep. All right.
So stop the recording. Thank you all.